it's time for True Crime Page with Scott Williams Collier.
Hello and welcome back to the True Crime Page podcast. I'm your host Scott Williams Collier. I hope all you guys you're all good. You're having a good week ahead. Today we'll be discussing the notorious London gangsters, East End villains, the Kray twins. Just before we do move on with that show, I just wanted to share some news with you that I've seen recently. Just thought I'd had to share this with you guys because it's one of the most brutal things that I've read for a while, and that is on the missing Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. A missing Saudi journalist may have recorded the moments he was allegedly tortured and killed on his Apple Watch, a Turkish newspaper reported. Jamal Khashoggi, a critic of the Saudi government, went missing more than a week ago after he entered the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, Turkey. Turkish officials believe the 59-year-old was murdered there by a 50-member Saudi assassination squad. Now, what makes this story really disturbing and sinister is apparently the recording that was relayed back to his iPhone, which was with his fiancée outside the consulate, recorded him being dragged onto a table in an office and being dismembered while he was still alive, and he took over 7 minutes to die. Now, I don't know about you, but that is pretty messed up. You can go and check that story out on Google. Moving on, if you guys already haven't checked out our blog, you can find our blog on Google by typing in Mob Talk Radio Mob Talk Radio True Crime blog. I personally haven't written anything on there recently, but my good friend and business partner and Mob Talk Radio host Jeff Canarsie has been writing quite a lot on there recently, covering some very interesting stories that are going on in America at the moment, covering the Joey Molino trial and sentencing, the mob war that's going on in Canada at the moment. It's going crazy over there. And also a recent hit that went down in New York with a mob associate. So go and check those out. Anyway, moving on with the show today. Now, when you think of London in the 1960s, especially the East End, one of the first things that come to your mind is Ronnie and Reggie Kray. Now, whatever you may think about their careers in organised crime, one thing is for sure, they certainly made a huge impact in their era in the 1950s and 1960s, rising from humble beginnings to crime bosses at the top of the underworld in the East End of London, something they did through years of violence and intimidation. And when we come back, we'll pick up the story of Reggie and Ronnie Kray. And welcome back, guys. Now, Ronnie and Reggie Kray were born on the 24th of October 1933 in Hoxton, East London, to Charles David Kray and Violet Annie Lee. The brothers were identical twins, with Reggie being born 10 minutes before his brother Ronnie. The parents also had an older son called Charles James Kray, who was born on the 9th of July 1927. Early on in life, the twins were very ill with diphtheria and they were kept in hospital. Although Reggie recovered from the illness very quickly, his brother Ronnie was really ill with the condition, and he was left in hospital to fight for his life. Eventually, the twins' mother, against the doctor's wishes, insisted that Ronnie come home with her. Now, she said as soon as she reunited Ronnie with his brother, he instantly started to get better and eventually recovered from the illness. Many think that the illness that Ronnie had in his younger years, diphtheria, was really did contribute to his future mental health problems. The twins first attended Wood Close School in Brick Lane and then Daniel Street School. In 1938, the Kray family moved from Steen Street in Hoxton to 178 Valence Road in Bethnal Green. Now, back in those days, that area was a ghetto. It was a very rough, tough area. It was renowned for its gambling dens, brothels and seedy pubs, and a very high crime rate. Much like the Krays in later years, their immediate family members were distinctive characters, and they were well known in their local area. The twins' paternal grandfather, Mad Jimmy Kray, was a renowned, hard-drinking, tough bar fighter. Their maternal grandfather, Jimmy Cannonball Lee, was a well-known boxer in his day and was responsible for the twins taking up the sports themselves as teenagers. At the beginning of the Second World War, the twins' father, Charles Kray, was conscripted into the army. He refused to go and went into hiding. Now, the funny thing is, that's something that the Kray twins would do themselves in later years when they refused to do their national service. The influence of the maternal grandfather, Jimmy Cannonball Lee, caused the brothers to take up amateur boxing, then a popular pastime for the working class boys of the East End of London. Sibling rivalry spurred them on, and they both achieved some success. It is said, as amateurs, they never actually lost any bouts at all. Now, I can't confirm whether that's true or not, but if it is, that's very impressive. So they apparently never lost any fights before they turned professional at the age of 19. The same year they turned professional, at 19, in 1952, they were conscripted to do national service. Now, back in those days, national service was compulsory. It was something that you had to do. You couldn't get out of it unless there was some kind of medical reason. They were called up to serve with the Royal Fusiliers in 1952. They reported, but attempted to leave after only a few minutes. The corporal in charge tried to stop them both, but Ronnie punched him on the chin, leaving him seriously injured. The Krays apparently walked back to the East End, where they were arrested eventually the day after, and turned over to the army. Now, while they were absent without leave, they assaulted a police officer who tried to arrest them. They were also among the last prisoners to be held at the Tower of London before being transferred to Shepton Military Prison in Somerset for a month to await court-martial. They were eventually convicted and sent to the Buffs Home Counties Brigade Depot Jail in Canterbury, Kent. Now, their behaviour in prison was apparently appalling. They were constantly being a pain for the prison. They were attacking the prison guards. They attacked fellow inmates. Some of the things they did, they tried to dominate the exercise area outside their one-man cells. They tipped a lantern bucket over a sergeant. They dumped a Dixie, which is a large food and liquid container, full of hot tea over another guard. Handcuffed the guard to their prison bars with a pair of stolen handcuffs, and also set their bedding on fire. They were moved to a communal cell where they assaulted the guard with a china vase and escaped. They were quickly recaptured and awaited transfer for to a civilian authority for crimes committed while at large. They spent their last night in Canterbury drinking cider, eating crisps and smoking cigars, courtesy of the young National Service men acting as their guards. Now, their behaviour in prison and their criminal records effectively ended their boxing careers, and they had their boxing licences taken away from them. Reggie Kray had a pro record of 7 wins, no losses and 2 knockouts, and Ronnie had a record of 4 wins and 2 losses and 4 knockouts. Out of the brothers, it was said that Reggie had the most promise. He had the better temperament to go further. Ronnie was too wild, too aggressive. He even got disqualified in one of his professional bouts. After losing their boxing licences, the brothers turned to full time. They eventually bought a rundown snooker club in Mile End, where they started several protection rackets. Now the interesting thing is, it's here where they first tried to get shaken down by Greek gangsters. Apparently the story goes some Greek mob guys went in there, they tried to shake them down, and Ronnie chased them out of the club with a bayonet. It would be the last time that anybody would try to shake the Kray twins down. Now the Kray twins and their gang, the Firm, they were basically known as a very ruthless, violent gang. They won't think twice about stabbing you or shooting you with a pistol. In 1956, they had a street fight with a rival gang known as the Watney Streeters. The Krays and their associates were involved in a brawl with the gang. This is where Ronnie Kray bayonet stabbed a guy called Terry Martin, a member of the rival gang. Now the rest of the Kray gang, the Firm, escaped, but Ronnie was caught and convicted and served 3 years in jail for GBH and firearm possession. By the end of the 1950s, the Krays were working for Jay Murray from Liverpool. They were involved in hijacking, armed robbery, arson, through which they acquired other clubs and properties. In 1960, Ronnie Kray was imprisoned for 18 months for running a protection racket and related threats. While Ronnie was in prison, Peter Ratchman, head of a violent landlord operation, gave Reggie a nightclub called Esmeralda's Barn in Knightsbridge. Basically, that increased the Krays' influence in the West End by not just making them successful criminals, but also making them celebrities as well. They were also assisted by a banker named Alan Cooper, who wanted protection against the Krays' rivals, the Richardson gang from South London. The Firm, the Krays gang, was basically from, as I mentioned earlier, from Bethnal Green. And the Kray twins ran their firm from an old billiards club, which they bought with a loan from their brother. The gang was formed with Cockney and Scottish criminals, and they were basically involved. It started off small at first, doing several protection rackets, and obviously that got bigger and bigger. It escalated into other crimes as well, like armed robbery and hijacking and arson. They also extorted money from other criminals in the area. So they basically put a street tax on other criminals. If you were involved in any major crime, drug dealing, bank robberies or anything like that, and the Krays knew about it, and you did it on their patch, you had to pay a street tax to Reggie and Ronnie. Basically what they would do, they would send members of their firm round to speak to the criminal and tell them to pay the street tax and pay up. If they didn't, they'd leave them alone and then go back to speak to them a few days later, and they said no again. They'd beat the hell out of them, and they'd just keep coming back until they gave up some money and paid a street tax to them. In 1956, Ronnie shot a car dealer in the leg. during a botched deal. He was basically identified by the victim as the attacker, but he got away from with prosecution by pretending to be Reggie, who had a solid alibi. Now, on November the 5th that year, Ronnie was sent to Wandsworth Prison for an unrelated assault in the Britannia public house, leaving Reggie in charge of the firm. He opened a nightclub called a Double R in the East End in 1957. The brothers also brought in their older brother Charlie to handle the nightclub accounts. Ronnie was known to be very intimidating, although he would usually be sedated on strong doses of Stemetel. His almost Jekyll and Hyde mood swings would instill fear into members of the firm. His violence was ruthless and somewhat sadistic, whereas Reggie was more reasoned and level-headed. Ronnie's behaviour would he'd basically flip within minutes if he was unhappy with you. He could become erratic and hell-bent on getting what he wanted. Ronnie suffered from schizophrenia, which is more commonly referred to as split mind. Basically, people with that condition, their responses, their behaviour, the speech, the thinking, it's unrelated to what's going on and what's happening around them in the real world. Now, there's been many members of the firm over the years in the 50s and the 60s. The main members were obviously Ronnie Kray, Reggie Kray and Charlie Kray. Also in the firm was Albert Donahue, who was Reggie's right-hand man. Now, an interesting story about Albert Donahue was how he became a member of the firm. He actually said something to the twins in a pub one day, and they construed it as a threat. And when Albert turned his back to go to the bar, Reggie pulled out a gun and shot him in the leg. Now, because Albert didn't say anything to the police and he didn't grass on them, the Kray twins were impressed by that, and that's something that they looked out for in people. If you was loyal, you ain't going to talk to the police or cooperate with people. That's something that they had a lot of time for and a lot of respect for. So basically, a while later after that incident, they called him for a meeting in a pub, and they offered him a place on the payroll, and he became a member of the firm. Other members of the firm were Ian Barry, John Dixon, Ronnie Bender, Ronnie Knight, Pat Connolly, Tommy Brown, Leslie Payne. Now, Leslie Payne was basically the brains behind the Kray twins. He was a businessman and a con man, and he basically helped the Krays run their criminal empire. He helped them organise their rackets and run the clubs. So he was somebody who was very instrumental in their success, in making money and running their criminal empire, basically. Other members included Billy Donovan, Dickie Morgan, Connie Whitehead, an ex-boxer, Billy Exley. There were some fringe members who were associates of the Krays. They were Teddy Smith, Tony Lambrianu, Chris Lambrianu, Limhouse Willie, Jack McVitty, who we'll speak about a little bit later, Mickey Fawcett, Frank Shear, Sammy Lederman, Nobby Clark, Johnny Davis, Anthony Barry, Lenny Hamilton, Billy Frost, Tommy Cowley, Eric Mason and Dave Simmons. Now, Ronnie Kray was obsessed with the American Mafia and American mobsters like Charles Lucky Luciano. He liked to style himself and people like that. He had a lot of respect for the American Mafia. He insisted everybody in his firm call him Colonel. And both himself and his brother Reggie had their own drivers as well. Now, it's worth a mention too, before we go on to the next piece, that some of you may not be aware, something you may not be aware about the Kray twins, and that is that they were both actually bisexual. Now, that's quite unusual. You don't normally see things like that in major organised crime. But Ronnie was very open about his sexuality. On the other hand, Reggie was kind of ashamed of it, and he liked to keep it secret. He didn't really want anybody to know about it. In 1964, Ronnie came to public attention again when when an expose in the tabloid newspaper Sunday Mirror insinuated that he had conceived a sexual relationship with Robert Lord Boothby, a Conservative politician at the time, when male homosexuality was a criminal offence back then in the UK. Now, although no names were printed in the piece, the twins threatened the journalist involved, and Boothby threatened to sue the newspaper with the help of Labour Party leader Harold Wilson's solicitor Arnold Goldman. Wilson wanted to protect the reputation of Labour MP Tom Drigberg, a practising homosexual known to associate with both Boothby and Ronnie Kray. And this was just weeks ahead of the pending general election in which Labour was hoping to win. In the face of this, the newspaper backed down, they sacked the editor and printed an apology, and they paid Boothby £40,000 in an out-of-court settlement. Because of this, the newspaper was unwilling to expose the Krays' connections and criminal activities. Now, an interesting story about that as well is that the Kray twins actually blackmailed Lord Boothby after he got the £40,000, and he had to hand that over to them, or else they was going to go to the paper and confirm that Ronnie actually did have a sexual relationship with Boothby, and that's something that the Conservatives and obviously Boothby did not want getting out into the public realm. The police investigated the Krays on several occasions, but the brothers' reputation for violence made witnesses too afraid to testify. There was also a problem for both main political parties. The Conservative Party was unwilling to press the police to end the Krays' power for fear that the Boothby connection would again be publicised. And the Labour Party, in power from 1964, but with a wafer-thin majority in the House of Commons, and the prospect of another general election needed to be called in the very near future, they didn't want the Drigbergs' connection to Ronnie Kray to get into the public realm. Much later, Channel 4 established the truth of the allegations and released a documentary on the subject called A Gangster and the Pervert Peer, which was filmed and released in 2009. Now, you can go and check that out on YouTube. I know it's on there. I saw it the other day. So go and check that out. It's a good documentary about the Kray twins and their connection to politics and Lord Boothby. Ronnie Kray established himself in the London scene with his glamorous nightclubs and had celebrities such as members of Parliament, famous actors, singers as customers. In the 1960s, the twins were widely seen as prosperous and charming celebrity nightclub owners and were part of the swinging London scene. A large part of their fame was due to their non-criminal activities, as more on occasion socialising with lords, MPs and socialites, and show business characters including actors George Raft, Julie Garland, Diana Dawes, Barbara Windsor and Frank Sinatra. In the 60s, they were also photographed by a famous photographer called David Bailey. David Bailey's well known for photographing the royal family, and he's quite a famous photographer over here in the UK. Now, you know, I'm going to refer back to America when we look at this showbiz thing. When you're involved in major organised crime, especially when you're the boss of a criminal organisation, that is supposed to be a secret. You do not want everybody and their dog knowing about it. Okay, so we can see a problem here already, that especially Ronnie in particular, you know, he's he's been very public with his relationships with people, with politicians. They're being photographed with famous people. They're socialising with famous people, actors and singers. It's never a good idea, because you're just going to paint a target on your back, basically. You're making yourself known to the public. You're making yourself known to the authorities and the police. And, you know, we only need to look back at characters like Sam Giancana in America with the Chicago outfit, and look what happened to him eventually. It's never a good idea to court the attention of the tabloids and the government and the you know, the general population. You don't want people to know who you are. You want to stay in the shadows. You want to do everything, you know, on the sly and be quiet. You don't want to draw attention to yourself. So we can see, you know, that is going to cause problems for Ronnie and Reggie down the line. In 1965, Reggie Kray married Frances Shear. Basically, he'd been courting her on and off for quite a few years, and he kept asking her to marry him. She eventually said yes to him. By all accounts, the marriage was a very unhappy one and only lasted 8 months. Frances left and went back to live with her parents. Reggie tried to resolve their marital issues, and he arranged to take Frances on holiday to Ibiza. He suggested they do this as a second honeymoon to try and rekindle their relationship. Frances agreed and said that she could do that. On the 5th of June, she went for an appointment at the Hackney Hospital and seemed a bit brighter. The following day, she saw Reg, and they both went to book the tickets at the local travel agent. They farewelled each other at her brother's flat, and Reggie went home. Now, one of the main reasons why I think Frances was so unhappy is that she was basically absolutely terrified of Reggie's brother Ronnie. Ronnie didn't like Frances. He didn't like the fact that his brother's attention was being taken away from him and from the firm. And he was basically, you know, Ronnie was violent, he was unpredictable, he was very he would manipulate Reggie and push him along and egg him on to do things, and I think this really interfered in Reggie's relationship and his marriage with Frances and caused major issues. 1 month after they basically booked the appointment, booked the holiday, she attempted suicide by taking an overdose of barbiturates. On this occasion, she was revived. However, on the 7th, on June 1967, she succeeded in killing herself at her brother's flat at number 34 Wilborn Court, Hackney. That morning, on the 7th of June in 1967, he took his sister a cup of tea, as he usually did, carefully placing it on the bedside table. She seemed to be still, sleeping peacefully, so he left her and went to work. Now, although the marriage was never formally dissolved, an inquest came to the conclusion that Frances had committed suicide. In 2002, an ex-lover and fellow con of Reggie Krays came forward to allege that Frances was actually murdered by a jealous Ronnie. Bradley Allardyce spent 3 years in Maidstone prison with Reggie, and he explained, "I was sitting in my cell with Reggie, and it was one of those nights where we turned the lights down low and put on some nice music. Sometimes he would reminisce, he would get really deep and open up to me. He suddenly broke down and said, 'I'm going to tell you something I've only ever told 2 people, and something I've carried around with me, something that that's been a black hole since the day I found out.' He put his head on my shoulder and told me Ronnie killed Frances." He told Reggie what he'd done 2 days later. Now, I'm not too sure about that. I don't think it's beyond the realms of impossibility. I think Ronnie was a very violent and volatile person. He was known to be sadistic. I don't think it's impossible that he could have done something like that, but I think the more likely outcome with that is that I just think Frances was scared of him. She was unhappy with her life, and she was depressed. She didn't really want to be with Reggie because she was terrified of his brother, and I think the more likely thing is that she took her own life. You can't really take ex-con's words too seriously. Take it with a pinch of salt. He could have just been saying that to get a bit of money to sell his story to the newspaper. That's the way I look at it anyway. In the early hours of the 8th of March in 1966, a large fight broke out between the Richardson gang and another gang led by Billy Haywood. Kray associate Dickie Hart, who was with the Haywood gang that night, was shot dead outside the rear doors trying to escape. Allegedly, he was killed by Richardson gang member Mad Frankie Fraser. This basically acted as a catalyst for what was to happen next to George Cornell. George Cornell was he was a member of the Richardson gang. He was a well-known criminal in the south of London, and basically that would prompt Ronnie Kray several days later to kill him in retaliation for the killing of their associate Dickie Hart. And when we come back in the next part of the Kray twin story, we'll pick up with the George Cornell murder. And welcome back. Now, just before the break, we were discussing a gang fight that broke out between the Richardson gang and a fellow gang led by Billy Haywood. Now, that fight ended with the death of Kray associate Dickie Hart. He was shot by Mad Frankie Fraser. Basically, that would be the catalyst which would lead on to the death of George Cornell at the hands of Ronnie Kray. Now, if you've watched a lot of the documentaries and the movies, there's a lot of emphasis put on the fact that Ronnie Kray killed George Cornell because he called him names to his face, called him a fat puffer and called him a puff. Now, why that is true, he did call him those names. That isn't the main reason why he eventually killed George Cornell. He obviously didn't like the guy, but the main reason was in retaliation for killing their associate Dickie Hart. On the 9th of March 1966, Cornell and his friend Albie Woods entered the Blind Beggar pub, ordered some alcohol, and they sat upon stools at the bar and had a drink. At around 8:30 p.m, both men were approached by Ronnie Kray and Kray associate Ian Barry. Upon seeing him, Cornell smiled and said sardonically, "Well, just look who's here." He said that as a warning to the barmaid and the few others who were drinking in the pub that evening. Barry fired 2 shots into the ceiling while Kray walked towards Cornell. He took out a 9mm Luger and calmly shot him once in the forehead just above the right eye. The men turned and departed to a waiting car in the street. Cornell slumped against a nearby pillar. The bullet passed straight through him, and he was taken to a nearby hospital where he died later at around 3:30 a.m. in the morning. The news spread rapidly. Although Ronnie Kray was identified by several eyewitnesses as he calmly left the public house, no one would agree to testify against him, and the police were forced to release him and let him go. Now, this is one of the most stupid things that Ronnie Kray did, and as we can see, all these things that draw attention to the firm, a lot of them seem to be orchestrated by Ronnie Kray or involve him in some way. You know, a few years before this, he started a relationship with a well-known Tory MP, which got put in the newspapers and on TV, drawing attention to himself and the firm. And then a couple of years later, he's walking into a pub with no disguise in front of lots of eyewitnesses and shooting someone dead. Now, you know, these types of actions, if you keep doing them, they're going to come back to haunt you further down the line. And as we'll see in the Krays story, that is certainly the case. With Ronnie, because he didn't think like a normal person and he had schizophrenia and he had this sadistic personality, I think that the thing that motivated him more than anything, the thing that he desired more than anything, was to instill fear in people. He liked the reputation of being this dangerous gangster who nobody should mess with. He liked to instill fear in people. And I think he liked that notorious reputation more than doing things in a smart, intelligent way and staying off the radar. He wanted people to know who he was. You know, he socialised with famous people, and he's committing violent crimes in front of lots of witnesses as well. Believe it or not, that's not actually the most stupid thing he did. I believe the next thing that I'm going to discuss was probably one of the most stupid things he did, and that was helping a notorious prisoner, Frank Mitchell, escape from prison. Now, for any of you who don't know who Frank Mitchell is, he was a notorious prisoner in the 1950s and 60s, and he was known as the Mad Axeman. If I had to compare him to someone today you might know, I'd compare him to Britain's most violent prisoner at the moment, which is Charles Bronson. A lot of you have probably seen the movie about Charles Bronson. He was like the 1950s, 60s version of Charles Bronson. He was apparently a very large man, about 6'4". He was extremely strong. He had a bad temper, and he spent most of his time in and out of Borstals and prison. He's basically spent most of his life in prison. He was an absolute nuisance in prison. He was involved in riots. He was violent towards his fellow prisoners and prison guards. He escaped on several occasions. On one occasion, when he escaped, he attacked a man with an iron bar before stealing his clothes and money. When he was recaptured, Mitchell attacked the police with meat cleavers and was sent to Broadmoor. He escaped again, broke into a private home and held a married couple hostage with an axe, for which he was nicknamed the Mad Axeman in the press in October 1958. He was sentenced to life imprisonment for robbery with violence. Mitchell was sent to Dartmoor Prison in 1962, and whilst there his behaviour improved. He kept budgery guards and transferred to the Honour Party, a small group of trustees who were allowed to work outside the prison walls with minimal supervision. Mitchell was permitted to roam the moors and feed the wild ponies, and even visited nearby pubs. On one occasion he caught a taxi to Oakhampton to buy a budgery guard. The governor of the prison promised Mitchell that if he stayed out of trouble, he would recommend to the Home Office that he would be given a release date 4 years. 4 years later, Mitchell was aggrieved that he had still not received one. On the 24th of December 1966, Mitchell was led into the back of a van by Albert Donahue, thinking that he's going to be taken to a safe house in the countryside where he would later meet up with Ronnie Kray. That almost caused another argument when Mitchell realised that the girl they'd brought him, Lisa, wasn't coming with him, but Donahue persuaded him that it was much safer for her to follow on later in another vehicle. Waiting in the car were several men, including Freddie Foreman and Alfie Gerard, who were both armed with revolvers. Once the van doors were closed and the engine started, they opened up on Mitchell, killing him. Donahue thought that he heard 12 shots were fired before Mitchell was dead. His body was never recovered. Foreman later revealed that Mitchell's body was bound with chicken wire, weighted down and dumped in the English Channel. Reggie Kray cited springing Mitchell from prison was one of the biggest mistakes he ever made. Donahue also, and always did, insist that he did not know that they were going to kill Mitchell. Now, that is highly unlikely. A lot of criminals that are involved in this type of crime, when it becomes public knowledge, and they try to distance themselves from it and put the blame on other people. There's no way he didn't know that they were going to kill him. That he was one of the main members of the firm. He would have been very aware that the fact that they were going to kill him and get rid of him. So that's just nonsense. Moving on from that, a little bit later down the line, the Krays would then go on to commit the final murder, which would end up, eventually getting them caught and arrested and ending their reign in the East End, and they would end up spending the rest of their life in prison. Now, Jack the Hat McVitty was a known drug trafficker in the 1960s, and he was a loose associate of the Kray twins. He wasn't a permanent member of the gang, and he wasn't really a major criminal. He was just a petty drug dealer, really. He wasn't involved in any major crime. Basically, what sealed his fate was Ronnie Kray apparently paid McVitty £500 in advance to kill his ex-partner, business partner, Leslie Payne. Now, if you remember a bit earlier in the podcast, I mentioned that Leslie Payne was a businessman and a con man, and he basically was the brains behind the Kray twins. He helped run all their nightclubs and their rackets for them, and he helped them launder their money. Basically, Leslie Payne decided to step away from the Krays because he was getting very concerned about the amount of and the level of violence that they were doing and the crimes they were committing. He didn't want to get dragged in with them, so he basically stepped away, walked away. That enraged Ronnie Kray, and in retaliation he wanted to have him killed. So legend has it, he gave Jack McVitty £500 in advance to kill him, and after the job was done he would give him another £500. Basically, Jack McVitty and his friend Billy Exley set off to go and shoot Payne, but they were unsuccessful. Exley, the driver, suffered from heart trouble, and McVitty was now heavily dependent on drugs. Exley started to lose his nerve when McVitty produced a handgun, in Exley's words, the size of a bleeding cannon. Arriving at Payne's home, McVitty hammered loudly on the front door, which luckily for Payne was opened by his wife. She instructed them that he's not home. She said he said he's not in. She said that's all right, said McVitty, and he and Exley both left. Instead of repaying the money, McVitty kept it. This incident led in part to McVitty's death. On the 29th of October 1967, McVitty was invited to a party in Everingham Road in Stoke Newington, London, with several of his underworld associates and their families. The Krays had secretly arrived at the party before McVitty and spent an hour clearing away the guests. Reggie's initial plan was to shoot McVitty upon entry. Basically, if you watch the film, It's depicted in the movies of the Krays. He pulled out a gun and aimed it at him, and the gun jammed. And then he decided to kill him with a knife. Now, this was a very messy murder, and again, it's been done in front of lots of witnesses, and this was all being orchestrated and planned by Ronnie Kray. He was the person that was always pushing his brother along, Reggie. He kept going on and on and on at Reggie, saying, I've got my button, now it's your turn, and he kept pushing Reggie, telling him he had to do this. And to me, it's just crazy. First of all, you kill George Cornell in front of people, in front of lots of witnesses in a pub. You don't try to disguise yourself at all. And then you go and spring the most famous prisoner in Britain from prison because you seem to think that it's going to help him in some way, which is just crazy. And then when he becomes too much trouble for you, you decide to murder him and dump him in the English Channel. And then you're going to get your brother to stab Jack McVitty in front of lots of witnesses at a party in London. It's just asking for trouble, and it's not going to work out well for you in the long run. Following McVitty's murder, the Krays and several other members of their gang were finally arrested by Scotland Yard police officers who had been watching their exploits for years. At the Old Bailey on the 4th of March 1969, both were found guilty of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment, with a recommendation that they should all serve a minimum. The Kray twins, should serve a minimum of 30 years in prison. Not only did they commit these pointless and crazy crimes, what also sealed their fate is that the Kray twins were trying to hatch some plan to get other people in their firm to take the blame for the murders. They wanted Scotch Jack Dickinson to confess to the murder of Cornell. They wanted their cousin Ronnie Hart to take the blame for the McVitty murder, and Albert Donahue to stand for the Mitchell murder. Obviously, that didn't go down well with the firm members. Donahue told the twins directly that he wasn't prepared to be cajoled into pleading guilty for a murder he didn't commit. He then informed his mother to instruct the chief investigator, Nipper Reid, that he wanted to sit down and have an interview with him and tell him everything that he knew about the Krays. Ronnie Hart had initially not been arrested for any crimes. He wasn't a name that was sought after by the police at the time. Unfortunately for him, with Donahue's testimony, Hart was hunted down, found and arrested. He was offered the same terms as the other firm members, that if they came onto the side of the law and offered up information on the Krays, they would get given a lighter sentence. Hart then told Reid everything that had happened during the McVitty murder. Although he did not know anything about what had happened to his body, this was the first time that the police knew exactly who was involved, and it offered them a solid case to prosecute the twins for McVitty's murder. Although Reid knew for certain Ronnie Kray had murdered George Cornell in the Blind Beggar pub, no one had been prepared to testify against the twins. Upon finding out the twins intended to cajole him into taking blame for the murder, Scotch Jack Dickinson also turned in everything he knew about Cornell's murder. Although he wasn't a witness to the actual murder itself, he was an accessory, having driven Ronnie and Ian Barry to the pub. The police still needed an actual witness for the murder. They managed to track down the barmaid who was working in the pub that evening. They gave her a secret identity, and she testified to seeing Ronnie killing Cornell. The Frank Mitchell disappearance was much harder to obtain evidence for, since the majority of those arrested were not involved with his planned escape and disappearance. Reed decided to proceed the case and have a separate trial for Mitchell once the twins had been convicted. At the trial, the twins' defence under their counsel, defence counsel John Platts Mills QC, consisted of flat denials of all charges and discrediting witnesses by pointing out their criminal past. Justice Melford Stevenson said, In my view, society has earned a rest from your activities. In March 1969, both were sentenced to life imprisonment with non-parole period of 30 years for the murders of Cornell McVitty, the longest sentences ever passed at the Old Bailey for murder. Their brother, Charlie, was in prison for 10 years for his part in the murders. Ronnie Kray was the head of the firm, and he was known as the Colonel. He was a violent man, he had a short temper, and he would not hesitate to resort to violence. He was also mentally unstable. Years later, Ronnie was, as I said, diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. Ultimately, the main thing that motivated Ronnie, he enjoyed the notoriety and he liked instilling fear in people. His behaviour and decision making and the decisions he made, were irrational and reckless. And I mean, none were more reckless and irrational than helping Britain's most famous and violent prisoner escape from prison, Frank Mitchell. I'll never be able to understand why he did that. Even Reggie Kray said years later that's the most stupid thing he ever did in his criminal career, and he deeply regrets that. If you help somebody who's a notorious prisoner and well known throughout the land in a prison system, you're going to have the press all over it. It's going to be on TV. That just draws so much heat and attention on you, and then you're surprised that you can't control a guy when you know that he's got a bad reputation for being violent and uncooperative, and then you have to go and kill him. It's just stupid. Ronnie Kray's criminal record from 1950 onwards consisted of an attempt to take and drive away a motor car without consent, sentenced 1 day police detention. On the 1st of November in 1950, he was charged with assaulting a police officer. He got 2 years probation. On the 26th of February 1953, he was charged with assaulting a police officer. He got 1 month imprisonment. He was also charged in 1956 with wounding with intent and possessing an offensive weapon, and he was sentenced to 3 years in prison and 6 years imprisonment to run concurrently. On the 7th of March in 1960, he was arrested for attempting to bribe a police officer, driving without due care and attention, and failing to display L plates. He was also fined £50 and disqualified from driving for 1 month. On the 3rd of December in 1960, he was charged with being found in a common gaming house and was issued with a good behaviour order for 12 months. He was also fined for unlawful gaming and fined in 1962. And obviously in 1969 he was charged with the murder of George Cornell and Jack McVitty. The records there date back to October 1950, when the Krays' criminal tendencies started just days after their 17th birthday. They appeared in juvenile court and were sentenced to 1 day in police detention for attempting to take and drive away a motor car without consent. Ronnie appeared at the magistrates' courts on a couple of charges of assaulting police, and at the Old Bailey in London accused of wounding with intent and possessing a loaded revolver. In a brutal character assessment, the report said Ronnie Kray has been a leader of a ruthless and terrible gang for a number of years. He has strong homosexual tendencies and an uncontrollable temper, and has been able to generate terror not only in the lesser minions of his gang, but also in the close and trusted members. He would brook no incompetence or interference from anyone, and was very conscious not only of his own public image, but also that of his underlings. For this reason, he used to like to set an example and enjoyed the name of Colonel amongst his subordinates. He added, he has an extremely violent criminal with homosexual tendencies who would not hesitate to kill in any circumstances. And that's basically it, really. The Kray twins will certainly go down in history as a feared and violent group of gangsters in the turbulent 60s. They weren't great businessmen. They weren't very intelligent as well. And they certainly weren't as organised and as powerful as their rival gangs like the Richardson gang in South London. You know, when you've got somebody like Ronnie Kray, who's mentally unstable, he suffers from paranoid schizophrenia. When he's the head of your firm and he's instructing people what to do, he's calling all the shots. You've got a big problem. As we've seen in the podcast, he made some very, very stupid, very ill-advised decisions. He brought a lot of heat on the firm and on his brother, and ultimately that ended in their downfall and spending the rest of their life in prison. Ronnie died in prison, I think, in 1995. Reggie Kray was allowed out of prison on compassionate leave when he had bladder cancer, and he passed away in hospital. And he basically ruined their lives. Reggie probably wouldn't have gone the same way as his brother if he didn't have his brother pushing him along. But you know, Ronnie Kray was very manipulative. He was very controlling, and you know, everybody was scared of him. So they basically did what he did, what he told them to do. I'd like to just read you a little statement, or a quote, sorry, which was in Ronnie Kray's autobiography. And he was quoted as saying, "They were the best years of our lives. They called them the swinging 60s. The Beatles and the Rolling Stones were rulers of the pop music. Carnaby Street ruled the fashion world. And me and my brother ruled London. We were fucking untouchable." I think that sums up Ronnie Kray and the Kray twins. And that's the show for today. I saw it's been a bit late coming. I should have had this up last week, but better late than never. I hope you enjoyed it. Our next show is going to be the Yorkshire Ripper, Peter Sutcliffe. That's something that I know quite a lot about, so I'm going to enjoy doing that. I'm going to get that sorted out and get that up as soon as I can. If you enjoy the True Crime Page podcast, please subscribe and share the channel with your friends and family. That's all I can ask, really. And that's it, really. Check back with us next week. We should have the Yorkshire Ripper show up. I hope you all have a nice weekend, guys, and I'll catch you later. Thank you. Bye.